By the fall of 1870, folks along the Arkansas River had learned not to stare too long when Charlotte Green walked by. They called her Lottie. Short woman, face already lined before 40, back a little bent from washing other people's clothes. And that belly, round and high as a woman close to delivery. Except everyone knew she had been about to deliver since before the war, since the days when the land around Pine Bluff was still Harper Plantation and not yet a checkerboard of contracts and debts. That night, the air by the river felt heavy, like another body in the room. The cabin was old slave timber, patched and repatched. Rain tapped at the roof. The smell of wet earth pushed in through the cracks. Lottie lay on a straw mattress near the hearth, dress bunched above her hips, bare feet planted, fingers clawed into the ticking. Sweat ran down her neck. Her swollen belly heaved under her thin brown skin. "It ain't like the other times," she muttered, teeth clenched. "It's cutting down my spine." Beside her, Aunt Dinah wiped her face with a rag dipped in cool water. Dinah had been catching babies on that ground since before Lottie's mother was born. Her hair, once coal black, had gone gray around the edges. Her hand stayed steady. "Hush, child," she said, though Lottie had not been a child for 20 years. "Whatever been sittin' in you so long, it done made up its mind tonight." In the corner, Lottie's younger cousin Esther twisted her apron, trying not to look frightened. She had watched Lottie carry that burden since she herself was little. Some days the older woman moved slow. Other days she worked like anyone else, but the belly never changed. No infant's cry ever followed. Now, with each cramp, a sound came out of Lottie that was half groan, half prayer. The door opened on a gust of damp air. Dr. Elijah Ward stepped in, shaking off his coat. A white man in his 30s, beard trimmed to show he belonged in town, not in the fields. He had been the plantation doctor once, then the town doctor, and now called himself a surgeon when speaking to colleagues from Little Rock. He glanced at the room, nostrils flaring at the mix of sweat, lamp smoke, and iron. "I came as quick as I could," he said. "Where's the patient?" Aunt Dinah answered with her chin. "Right where she been these 20 years, doctor." He set his bag down, tried for professional distance. "Charlotte, we have talked about this," he began, feeling for a pulse at her wrist. "What you carry is almost certainly a growth, a mass. The pains may mean it is shifting. It is not—" His words cut off when another contraction seized her. Lottie's back arched, heels digging into the mattress. "Oh, Lord, take it out," she gasped. "Either it go, or I go with it." The muscles of her abdomen drew tight in a way Ward had seen hundreds of times, but never on this woman. He moved his hands lower, pressed gently, then more firmly, then looked at Aunt Dinah with a flicker of unease. "This feels organized," he said under his breath. "There are contours." Dinah's dark eyes held his. "I told you long time ago, doctor. This ain't no sack of potatoes. Something been biding its time." The hours that followed blurred into a rhythm of shouts and low commands. Lamp wick turned up. Water heated, then cooled. Lottie panting, then forcing herself to bear down. Esther feeding wood to the fire, then standing back as if the flames themselves watched. Outside, hounds barked far off along the river road. Somewhere upriver, a steamboat blew its whistle. The world went on, unaware that in one small cabin, a body was trying to finish a labor begun before emancipation. Just before dawn, when the lamp was burning low and everyone's hands shook from fatigue, Lottie gave a sound, deeper than any she had made before. A ripping, tearing cry. Her whole frame bowed. Aunt Dinah leaned in with both hands. "There now," Dinah urged. "One more, girl, one more." Lottie strained, vision gone white at the edges. Something passed, heavy and resistant, scraping through her like gravel. Then, release. Her chest heaved. The weight that had defined her outline for half her life seemed to fall away all at once. She lay back, stunned, fingers spreading over a belly that now felt slack, unfamiliar. On a folded sheet at the end of the mattress lay what she had paid those years for. We will not linger over it in a gruesome way. It was small, the size of a newborn, but shriveled, the skin dull and gray, the limbs drawn up as if against a long cold, hard in places as though stone and bone had fused, fragile in others, edges flaking like old plaster. In the half-light, its face had no softness, only a tightness that made Aunt Dinah look away. Esther gagged and turned toward the wall. Dr. Ward stared. His hands, gloved in thin kid leather, hovered and then made contact, tracing the outline of a tiny shoulder. "This is impossible," he whispered. "To remain like this for so many years." Dinah sank to her knees, hands folded around the bundle as if it were warm. "It'd been taking her years into itself," she said quietly. "All them nights she couldn't sleep, all them days Massa called her lazy. He thought nothing was growing. It was growing right here." She pressed the cloth to her breast. "Stone baby, drinking time instead of milk." Lottie forced her eyes open, trying to see. "Let me hold him," she croaked. "Charlotte," Ward said quickly, finding his professional tone. "You must rest. This is a specimen of considerable." She fixed him with a look that had never passed between them when he was the plantation doctor and she the girl sent up from the quarters. "You've been calling it a case since I was 18, she said. Her voice was hoarse, but the words were clear. "I've been carrying it. You can call it what you please on your paper. That there is my lost time." For a heartbeat, Ward seemed ready to argue. Then he stepped back. Dinah placed the bundle for Lottie to touch, just briefly. The woman's fingertips traced the hard curve of what should have been a tiny skull. As she did, her face eased. Not joy, not exactly grief, more like the slackening of a rope that had been pulled too tight for too long. "It's out," she breathed. "Lord, it's finally out." The first pale line of morning showed at the window. Dr. Ward turned away, pulled a folded sheet from his bag, and began, with quick, shaking strokes, to sketch the thing on the bed. Around it he jotted words he could live with. Calcified fetus, extraordinary duration, colored woman near Pine Bluff. Our knowledge of that night hangs on those few lines. By the time his report reached the pages of an Arkansas medical journal, the names would be gone, some of the years clipped away. But in his first hurried draft, one could still read the raw number, retained in utero approximately 20 years. And behind that ink, if you look long enough, you might still hear Lottie's ragged whisper. Not a mass, not a joke. 2 decades, turned to stone. To understand how a woman ends up laboring for a child that never had a birthday, you have to walk back with her to the time when she was still called Girl. Before the war, the place was Harper Plantation, rows of cotton closing in on every side. Lottie was 16 then, maybe 17. No one kept her dates the way they did the mistresses. She was quick with a needle, light on her feet, good with trays and hot kettles, so they took her from the quarters and set her up to the big house. At first it meant less mud on her shoes and more starch on her dress. Then it meant being sent upstairs when Mr. Harper had whiskey in him, or when his son came home from town with talk about honor and property and the danger of spoiling white girls. The child that started inside her that year did not come from any husband of her choosing. Everybody in the quarters knew it without saying. Old men looked away. Young women tightened their mouths. Aunt Dinah, who had seen too much already, pressed Lottie's hand one morning by the washpot and murmured, "Don't you carry the shame for that, baby? That ain't yours." The months went by. Her waist thickened. The mistress pretended not to notice. Harper himself joked once on the veranda, loud enough for the field hands to hear, that these people breed like rabbits. One turns around, and another pup in the nest. He didn't say on whose hounds that litter depended. Late in the pregnancy, something happened that even Dinah remembered in fragments. One version says Lottie tried to run one wet night, got as far as the riverbank before. The overseer found her and struck her down with the flat of his rifle. Another says she was made to watch while they lashed a man to a post and opened his back for some small act of disrespect, and she stood there until her legs shook. However it was, Lottie went back to the quarters with blood between her thighs and a pain that felt like iron clamping shut. For days after, there were no more little kicks under her ribs, no flood of blood either, just silence. "The Lord done took it," the other women whispered, but the belly did not sink. It stayed high, stretched tight, as if time itself had stopped under her skin. When Dinah laid her ear against that taut curve, there was no heartbeat. Yet when she pressed, she felt something firm, shaped, not the soft looseness of a womb emptied too soon. "This one dug in," she told Lottie softly. "It dug in deep and won't come out to this dirt." "What that mean?" Lottie whispered. Dinah looked toward the big house before answering. "Maybe it say, I ain't coming into bondage. I wait. For what? I don't know. Freedom or the grave." It was the kind of saying you did not repeat where white men might hear. The master heard only what he chose. He did not believe in a pregnancy that did not end on his schedule. After a few months with no infant to sell or set to work, he accused her of malingering. One hot afternoon, he had her brought to the yard, shirt lifted to show the round swell in front of the staring hands. "You see?" he told them, poking her belly with a walking stick as if testing a melon. "She says there's a brat in there. I say the Lord spat it out long ago. That's just fat and stubbornness now. You ain't special, girl. If the Almighty wanted your kind mixing with mine, we'd have seen proof." Lottie stood there, bare skin slick with shame and heat, eyes fixed on a knot in the porch step. Inside, something cramped, then turned to stone again. Then came the war. Men in gray rode past, then men in blue. News traveled on rumors and on the backs of soldiers. Battles lost, battles won. A paper in Washington no slave ever saw that declared them forever free. On some winter night, someone slipped into the quarters with word that Union men had taken Pine Bluff. Later, there were Yankees on the road, and contrabands in government wagons. Through it all, Lottie moved slower, but did not fall. She carried water, cooked when ordered, hid in the woods when guns thundered, and always that mound in front of her stayed the same, neither rising nor receding, like a season that refused to change. Once, as cannon sounded faintly in the distance, she sat on a stump with Dinah and said, half in wonder, half in accusation, "They say we free now. If that was Massa's child, why he's still hiding in me?" Dinah took a long time to answer. "Some things don't step out the day a man sign a paper," she said, and laughed. "Maybe that little one decided he wasn't gonna be nobody's chattel. Maybe he choosing his hour. Or maybe what you carryin' ain't a child no more, but all them days stacked on top of each other." By the time Union uniforms were no longer a shock on Arkansas roads, the Harper name over the gate had come down, chopped and hammered into other uses. Land changed hands, then changed back under new contracts. Former slaves signed papers, making them partners in fields they had already worn their bodies out on. And Lottie, now counted among the freed, still rose each morning with that same heavy front, 2 wars older in her bones than in her face. She was no longer a house girl. She hired herself to wash in town or work a kitchen, moving carefully around chairs and kettles, avoiding questions. Children pointed sometimes. White men smirked. Some black women shook their heads and made the sign of the cross in the air when she passed. She told herself, on nights when her back ached and the old ache twisted inside, that whatever lodged there had outlived bondage and gunfire and the old master's laughter. That ought to mean something. She just couldn't tell if it was meant as punishment or as a witness. Years later, when someone from the bureau would ask how long she'd been in this condition, she would search for an honest number and come up with one that sounded like blasphemy. Since I was Mass's girl, and he still had the right to send for me. By then, the war was over on paper, but under her ribs, nothing had ended yet. By the time Reconstruction took hold, Lottie had learned to move through town without meeting anyone's eye. Pine Bluff felt different on the surface. Soldiers drilling on the courthouse lawn, missionary ladies organizing sewing circles for the uplift of the freed, bureau offices nailed together from old timber. Yet the air carried the same edge she remembered from the plantation. White folks watching, judging, weighing. Her belly still rode high, round as full term. A decade had passed since the war. Strangers thought she was days from labor. Neighbors knew better and lowered their voices when she walked by. It was a Freedmen's Bureau agent who first wrote her name down. He arrived with a leather satchel, spectacles slipping down his nose, reciting rules printed in Washington. He asked the same questions of every sharecropper: age, family, injuries from slavery, capacity for field work. When he reached Lottie, his pencil hovered. "How long have you been?" "Like this?" She folded her hands over the bulge, unsure whether to answer in years or in shame. "A long while, sir." He waited. 10, she said finally, choosing the smallest truth she could bear. He wrote approx. 10 years, paused again, and cleared his throat. "And you confirm you are expecting?" "I confirm I ain't never been rid of it," she murmured. He did not know what to do with that. Bureau forms had no line for a body that stayed full after war emptied everything else. He marked her as limited for field labor and moved on. Word spread quickly. Pine Bluff was small enough that any deviation, a fever, a theft, a new preacher, traveled faster than wagons. Within a week, a white pharmacist asked her employer, loud enough for customers to hear, "Is that your maid who's been expecting since Lincoln was a lawyer?" The chuckles prickled her skin even when she wasn't in the room. Miss Webster, a northern teacher at the Freedmen's School, tried a different approach. She came to Lottie's cabin with a basket of biscuits and a scripture pamphlet. "I've heard you're unwell," she said gently. "There are physicians now who don't charge colored folks. I can escort you." Lottie stiffened. Too many hands had decided things for her already. "It ain't sickness," she said. "It's something that stuck." Miss Webster gave a sympathetic smile, the kind that hid its own judgments. Sometimes the body holds on to grief the way a tree holds old scars. But doctors can help. Lottie declined, though the offer lingered like a draft under the door. A few weeks later, she ended up at the clinic anyway, not because she agreed, because her employer insisted after she collapsed near the stove. They sent her in a borrowed cart to the new county infirmary, a white building that smelled of soap and metal. Dr. Ward, the same man who would one day witness her final night of labor, recognized her immediately. His face tightened. He had prayed never to see her again, not because he feared her condition, but because it reminded him of everything he couldn't explain. He tapped the mound with 2 fingers, cautious, clinical. "No tenderness?" "Some. No movement." "Been no movement since before freedom." He exhaled sharply, almost offended by the persistence of the impossible. This cannot be pregnancy. Not after this many years. He summoned 2 younger doctors. They pressed, measured, murmured. One suggested a monstrous growth. Another mentioned lithic transformation, a term Lottie didn't understand, but could feel like a blade being sharpened on her bones. When she heard surgery, her breath seized. The memory of a whip splitting a man's back years ago flashed behind her eyes. The sound, the tearing, the way flesh could be opened without mercy. "You ain't cutting me," she said hoarsely. Dr. Ward raised a placating hand. "It might save your life. I've been alive with this longer than any of y'all been thinking on it." He dismissed the assistants and lowered his voice. "If you don't treat it, it could turn septic. You could die slowly, painfully." Lottie looked past him, toward the small hospital window. Outside, a group of freed children played in the yard, tossing pebbles until a white orderly shouted at them. "Maybe it's already been killing me slow," she whispered. "Maybe you just given it a name." The hospital discharged her with instructions she could neither read nor trust. No one told her the doctors had stayed late that night, discussing her as if she were a specimen in a traveling cabinet of curiosities. One man suggested sending a letter to a medical society in Little Rock. Another said the Bureau should revisit her case. A third chuckled that the colored imagination makes better stories than any journal. Back at her cabin, the community grew uneasy. Some women avoided her entirely. They feared her belly the way they feared storms and cholera. Others came quietly, touching her arm before church and whispering, "Pray for my boy," or "Pray my sister's child comes safe." One elder said, "What you carry ain't flesh no more. It's years that never got to breathe." Lottie lay awake most nights, listening to the river and her own pulse against the unchanging weight. 10 years, 12 years. She had lost count. Time outside kept moving. Cotton contracts, new statesmen, soldiers marching east, then west. But inside her, something stood still. She knew one thing with certainty. Whatever lived, or failed to live, beneath her ribs, had chosen a different clock than everyone else. And if it ever decided to leave, the world would not be ready for what came out. That thought followed her like a shadow she could not outrun. By morning, the cabin was strangely light. The lamp had gone out. Cool air slipped through the gaps. Lottie lay flat, palm on the empty slack of her belly, checking again and again that the weight was truly gone. On the table by her feet lay the bundle Aunt Dinah had wrapped in a sheet. It didn't stir. Under the cloth, a hard shape pressed against the weave. Dr. Ward sat under the window with his notebook. His quick sketch showed a curled form, limbs drawn up, faint curve of a skull. Beside it, he had written, "Retained in womb near 20 years," then scratched halfway through the number. "It should be taken to town," he said. "Preserved. We might prevent other women suffering so long." Dinah moved between him and the table. "She gave near all the years she had," she said. "You ain't taken this last piece." "It is evidence," he insisted. "If the society sees what bondage and neglect can do." "You gon' write which white man put it there?" she asked. He had no answer. On the bed, Lottie's voice rasped. "Y'all divvying me up?" she said. "He's the only proof I've been carrying something real. Don't tell me now it was nothing." For the first time, Ward seemed unsure. To him, it was an uncommon specimen. To her, it was the one witness that her 20 years had not been foolish talk. A sharp knock. Esther opened the door. A man from the Freedmen's Bureau, and the deputy stood there, hats in hand. "Heard Ms. Green finally had something," the deputy muttered. "Need to know if there's a child to register. Or a body." The bureau man glanced at the sheet and opened his ledger. "Name is Charlotte Green. Outcome?" Dinah folded her arms. Name you already got, she said. Outcome is this. What come out never breathed. Put down stillborn and be done. Ward began. You might also note. You might also keep quiet, Dinah said. The deputy shifted. Is it human? He asked. Lottie hauled herself up on one elbow. It hurt when they whipped me, she said. It kicked, when guns shook the ground. It laid on my insides, while I turned from girl to old woman. If that ain't human enough, your book don't deserve his name. They stepped back onto the stoop. In the ledger, the agent wrote, Charlotte Green, colored, delivered non-viable issue, long-standing enlargement relieved. He did not write 20 years. By midday, Ward tried once more. If I might take a small portion, he said. A fragment. The rest you may bury. Dinah shook her head. First Massa took her body. War took her time. Now you want what's left? No, sir. He go in the ground hole. That's the only whole thing she ever owned. Lottie whispered. You already took your piece, Doctor. In that book. Draw all you like. This here, go with me. When Ward set the bundle down again, a thin flake crumbled from one edge and turned to gray dust. See? Dinah murmured. That's years fallen off. Let the rest go back to dirt. That afternoon, they walked to the colored burying ground behind the weathered church. No bell, no white preacher. Dinah carried the bundle. Esther brought a shovel. Lottie stayed in bed, lips moving in a hoarse prayer. They chose a corner by a leaning cedar. The wet soil opened easily. Dinah lowered the shape as carefully as if it might still startle. No name board, only a rough stone pressed upright. Lord, she said, whatever was in there held what this place did to her. Take that load now. Don't let nobody dig it up for show. Near dusk, Ward sat again at the window and opened his notebook to a clean page. To the members of the Arkansas Medical Society, he wrote, I respectfully offer an account of an uncommon occurrence observed near Pine Bluff. His pen paused over the count of years. He wrote the full number and left it there, knowing some future editor might trim it, make her burden smaller on the page than it had been in her body. But that night, in his hand, the 20 years stayed black and whole, facing the unmarked mound beneath the cedar outside. The hall in Little Rock smelled of pipe smoke and varnish. Physicians in stiff collars settled into rows, while a clerk arranged decanters on a sideboard, as if the evening were a social call, rather than a meeting about illness and loss. Dr. Ward stood at the lectern, palms damp. He had practiced his remarks for weeks, trimming away every detail that hinted at the life behind the case. Gentlemen, he began, I present an instance of prolonged fetal retention in a colored woman near Pine Bluff. He described measurements, density, curvature. He did not mention a cabin by the river or the way the woman had guarded the bundle with both arms, even while bleeding. He recited instead the phrases he knew would please, rare, instructive, worthy of record. A senior physician raised an eyebrow. 20 years duration? Ward hesitated. Another laughed. Come now, Elijah. 10, perhaps. Anything more, and we risk ridicule. A third added, and spare us any plantation lore. Keep the article clinical. By the time the discussion ended, the group had agreed. The case would be printed, but with 10 years substituted, and with no mention of how the pregnancy began. The journal preferred anomalies without history. Across the state that same Sunday morning, the congregation at New Hope Colored Baptist filled the small church with murmured hymns. The pastor, Reverend Isaac Porter, lifted his worn Bible. Children, he said, we seen a sister freed on the outside and bound on the inside for near 2 decades. Don't let nobody tell you the Lord ain't mindful of burdens carried in silence. Lottie sat near the rear, head bowed, hands clasped together, as if holding something that was no longer there. Every sentence turned her life into a symbol, a warning, a testament. She felt each word pass over her like a hot wind. Porter meant kindness, but the story was no longer hers. It was becoming a sermon others would retell, without knowing the weight behind it. Meanwhile, in town, a white editor set type for a brief item wedged between advertisements. Curious notion among local Negroes. A woman claims to have borne a child for 20 years, now said to be a stone infant. Physicians attribute the tale to superstition and ignorance. He smirked as he printed it, confident his readers would laugh. Thus the tale split 3 ways in a single week: a sanitized medical phenomenon, a sacred metaphor, a cheap joke. Back in Little Rock after the meeting, Ward sat alone in his rented room, journal proofs stacked before him. They had reduced his account to half a column. Important notes were cut. The intact form, the partial crumbling, the burial refused to him. Gone, too, was any hint of the woman's defiance. He reached for his private notebook, the one he never submitted. On its pages, he had recorded details he dared not speak publicly. Her trembling hand over the bundle, Dinah's firm voice, the argument at dawn. He wrote now, slowly. I have witnessed a condition science can describe, but not encompass. The tissues were hardened, yes, but the burden borne was shaped by forces outside anatomy. Colleagues urged attachment. I find it increasingly difficult. At New Hope, evening service continued. Women hummed. Children leaned sleepily against their mothers. Reverend Porter prayed, Lord, teach us to see the wounds no doctor's eye can read. Lottie felt a strange pull, pride that they saw her pain, dread that they might never see her beyond it. That night, as lanterns winked out across Pine Bluff, a schoolteacher read the newspaper snippet aloud in a boarding house parlor. Laughter rose again. She folded the paper without comment, unsettled by the cold distance between the line of type and the woman she had once met at the pump. In his room, Ward closed his notebook and blew out the lamp. He knew the published version would circulate for years, quoted as proof of a rare lithic case. He also knew the true story would survive only where memory refused to be flattened, in whispered prayers, in the quiet grief of a woman who had carried more than any report would ever admit. What he could not know was that decades later, someone would find the medical journal beside a bureau ledger and a yellowed church pamphlet, and begin asking why the same event looked so different in 3 different hands. The woman in the wooden chair had hands like roots. It was 1937, in a schoolroom-turned-interview office, part of the Federal Writers Project. Cicadas screamed outside. A cheap fan pushed warm air from one side of the room to the other. The young white interviewer dipped his pen and asked the same question he asked everyone. Do you recall anything unusual from the old days? The old woman grinned without mirth. Honey, all of it was unusual, she said. But I expect you mean stories make good readin'. He nodded. Well, she said, eyes narrowing as she looked back over her own life. I remember a lady named Charlotte Green down round Pine Bluff, always big with nothin'. I was a chilly when they say she got that way, and I done had grandchildren 'fore her belly went flat. The pen slowed. How long? He asked. Long as I can remember, she answered. They say 20 year. Massa boy put a seed in her and it just wouldn't come see the sun. Stayed inside, turned to rock. When it finally come out, they say it looked like a little dry baby, all shrunk up. She shrugged. White folks called it sickness. We called it judgment. He wrote what he could catch, then added a small note in the margin. Local superstition regarding stone child and former slave woman. The transcript went into a file box and then into a warehouse. Dust did the rest. Almost 60 years later, in a university library in Little Rock, A different pair of hands slid that microfilm under a reader. Dr. Monique Harris, historian, watched the grainy typescript appear on the screen. The phrase, Charlotte Green, brightened something in her mind. She had seen the name elsewhere. She flipped through her notes. One pile held copies of Freedmen's Bureau reports. Charlotte Green, colored, distended abdomen, claims pregnancy of 10 years. Another contained a photocopy from an 1870s medical periodical, Lithopedion, in a negress of Arkansas, 10 years retention. And now this. They say 20-year. 10. 20. Harris leaned back, staring up at the ceiling tiles. Somewhere between Lottie's body and the printed page, somebody had clipped a decade away. Not from the condition, from the story. She began charting the fragments on a yellow pad. Plantation records, bureau ledgers, the journal case, the WPA memory. Each document spoke in a different accent, but the outline was the same. A girl forced, a body stalled, long years of carrying what shouldn't have been hers to carry. Across town, in a modern hospital, Dr. Alicia Jackson scanned an ultrasound image. Her patient, a black woman in her 40s, stared at the monitor. "I thought I was done with babies," the woman said. "So what is that?" "Not a pregnancy now," Dr. Jackson answered carefully. "It's a little mass. Likely from a pregnancy that ended years back and never passed. Your body sealed it off. Very small. We can remove it safely." The woman exhaled, half laughing, half close to tears. "My grandma used to tell a story," she said, "about some kin way back who carried a stone baby near all her life. We all thought she was just talking." She shook her head. "Guess this run in the blood, too." That night, troubled by the echo, Jackson searched medical databases. An old citation popped up. Lithopedion, Arkansas, 19th century. The abstract mentioned a black woman and a decade-long retention. No name, just colored. A week later, at a regional conference, Harris and Jackson met over coffee after a panel on race and medicine. Within minutes, Lottie was between them. "She's everywhere and nowhere," Harris said, tapping a folder. "In the journal as a curiosity, in bureau notes as a labor problem, in church pamphlets as a parable, in an old woman's mouth as a warning." Jackson added quietly, "And in my exam room, in a patient who thinks she's cursed when really she's been badly served." They argued over how to write about Charlotte. Harris wanted her full. The assault implied, the years of ridicule, the burial under a cedar. Jackson worried about turning her into a spectacle for physicians who still preferred cases without context. "If we leave out what was done to her," Harris said, "we do exactly what those men in Little Rock did. We cut history away from the body." "And if we give them every awful detail?" Jackson countered. "Will they see a human being or another interesting abnormality?" In the end, they decided on 2 texts. One, for a medical audience, would insist on naming race, coercion, and the way diagnosis had ignored both. The other would be written for the public, where Charlotte Green would appear not as negress, age unknown, but as a woman who lived, worked, prayed, and argued for the right to bury what had been forced upon her. Months later, Harris stood at the edge of the overgrown colored cemetery outside Pine Bluff, following directions pieced together from maps and memory. Cedars cast long shadows over tilted stones. There was no marker with Charlotte's name. Perhaps there never had been. Still, she laid a small bouquet near a likely patch of ground. "We don't know exactly what lies here," she murmured. "Bone, lime, ash, 20 years of somebody else's sin. But we know who lay above it, and that's more than your doctors ever cared to write." Somewhere, on a shelf, a bound volume still carried the shortened number, the cleaned-up case. Somewhere else, in a digital archive, A WPA page preserved an old woman's insistence on the full count of years. And now, in the minds of those who heard the story retold, in rooms, in podcasts, in quiet late-night listening, Charlotte Green existed again, not just as a specimen, but as a person whose body had been made to hold far more time than any life should be asked to bear.